Here's some examples of ways that people do flat frames. You can see in the upper left here the t-shirt method, which is what I use. It looks like they've actually cut a t-shirt and made a bracket or something for it, but what I do is just stretch a t-shirt across there, get all the wrinkles out, and hold it in place with the dew shield, which fits over that. And then different electroluminescent plates you can buy because you're trying to get a very even illumination. People use laptop screens with some software to put up a white even illumination. Maybe they use Photoshop or something for that. Here's what a flat frame might look like with some issues in the optical train that it's going to correct for. So there's some dark spots here, and there's a little bit of vignetting in the corners, a little darker. So those will get subtracted out of your light frames as part of the calibration and stacking process. Speaking of stacking, I've done another video on Deep Sky Stacker, which is a free stacking program that works with both DSLR and CCDs. So look, next step now that you've captured the data and all your calibration frames is then to go and stack the data and process it. For my DSLR stuff, I use Backyard EOS for DSLR capture. I use Deep Sky Stacker for calibration, stacking, and alignment. When I'm doing CCD stuff, I use Sequence Generator Pro, and there's CCD Stacker 2 for calibration, stacking, and alignment. I use Adobe Raw, which comes with Photoshop and Photoshop itself, to manipulate the images and finish them off. And there's a bunch of plugins for Photoshop, some specifically for astrophotography functions, and some like noise reduction that are made for other things but that are useful for astrophotography. And then there's also what are called action sets. So you can get it, Photoshop is a scriptable program, so you can get these action scripts that do things like local contrast enhancement and reducing stars and all kinds of stuff. Of course, there's options for each of these different functions as to what software that you use, which we'll talk about, I think, in a coming slide. But the sort of the process is probably the same. You know, you're going to be looking at your subframes that you took and getting rid of the lesser quality ones because they're, you know, cloudy, they have aircraft trails or satellite trails, although to a certain extent, if you had a lot of subframes, you can eliminate those and still use the rest of the data, or there's tools that help reject that data, but in general, reject the lesser quality subframes. Then you use the software to bring in your calibration files, your darks, your flats, and your bias, and use those to calibrate the light frames. Then you stack them, which gives you, one output image that's going to have better signal to noise ratio and maybe even better resolution based on drizzle or some, there's all kinds of stacking tricks. And then assuming you're going to process in Photoshop, you're going to want to save that as a 16-bit TIFF. Speaking of Adobe Camera Raw, by default it won't open TIFF files, it just opens Camera Raw files. There's if you go into Photoshop and options down at the bottom, I think there's Adobe Camera Raw settings inside Photoshop, and there you can tell it to open TIFF files as well. And there's a lot of basic but easy to use tools in Camera Raw that can quickly do stuff that takes maybe more difficult in Photoshop itself, and it might just be a quick way. Also, it has sort of digital development. There's an auto link that you can hit that will automatically set the exposure, digitally developing your picture, and that's handy. And then of course in Photoshop there's whole books and many tutorials on doing astrophotography in Photoshop, but you're going to do levels, curves, sharpen, reduce noise, and I talked about the Astro plugins and actions. You can also use Photoshop to combine, if you've got a monochrome camera, a CCD camera, to combine LRGB frames and assign them to colors, or if it's narrowband, assign the colors and using layers and screen modes and create a color image out of the individual monochrome images. So again, there's lists of image capture options: Backyard EOS, Backyard Nikon, Sequence Generator Pro, Maxim DL, AstroArt, Nebulosity. There's a new one called Prism that's just come out. It's supposed to be kind of a soup to nuts, everything astrophotography, from controlling your camera and your mount and image acquisition to processing. And then in terms of the image processing, Deep Sky Stacker we talked about. Iris is free if you've got CCD images and you need to change that FITS format to something else. FITS Liberator is free. Then there's Maxim DL, AstroArt, Nebulosity, CCD Stack, PixInsight. Star Tools might be worth looking at. It's completely different in its approach to everything else, and some people get really good results with that, and it's not very expensive. And then, as I said, Prism is brand new, at least the current version. I guess it's been around in Europe for 20 years or something, but it's just now been sort of commercialized and re-released in a new format. Then of course you have what we've categorized here as paint programs, or maybe they should be called photo processing programs. Photoshop, or the lighter version of that, Photoshop Elements, although that's missing some sort of important features, namely curves. There's GIMP, which is kind of a free Photoshop clone, but I meant to check again, but it was only 8 bits of color depth up until, I haven't, like I said, I haven't checked yet. I think there was a beta version of 16 bits, but I don't know if it's come out yet. So unless it's going to be 16-bit, I wouldn't bother, but if it is available with 16 bits and it's still free, then that's probably a good alternative, although you probably won't have the actions and plugins that you can buy that help you with Photoshop for Astro. PaintShop Pro is another program. And then I've listed here some of the Planetarium software that you use in planning and maybe also driving your scope, doing go-tos. Stellarium, which is what I use. Cartus du Sol. You can see Mead, the Sky, Starry Night Pro, Maxim DL, and Prism, again being a new all-in-one program. So this brings us to the question of, okay, so what should I buy? And I would argue that you shouldn't buy anything first. You should use the SJAA loaner program. So there's something called a Quick Start program where you learn a little astronomy and how to navigate in the night sky, and you learn how to use a telescope, and this will help you find out how really interested in pursuing this you are, and it will also help you in understanding what types of things you'd like to take astro images of, because the gear that you need for planetary versus deep sky versus nightscapes is all a little different. And once you've completed that Quick Start program with SJAA as a club member, then you can borrow scopes for, I believe it's a month at a time. Get out and work with it yourself and see what's going to work for you. Also, there's the concept of the robotic telescopes like itelescope.net, where you can pay by the month to access very expensive high-end gear on mountaintop observatory sites. And because astrophotography can be a very expensive hobby when you get into some of the more professional gear, that might be a way to get some really good quality data and create some really good images without spending as much as you would on a car, for instance, which is what you could easily spend or more on really high-end equipment. I guess in all of this, I haven't mentioned this background photo that I've used for as background for these slides, and this is actually a wide field mosaic taken with some of the gear from itelescope.net. So that's an example of what I've been able to do with itelescope.net. When you do get ready to shop and buy, please keep in mind that the mount is the most important thing. It's more important than the telescope itself. It's more important than the camera, because if you don't have a mount that can go to and most importantly track with the amount of gear that you want to put on it, then you've essentially wasted your money. And a good rule of thumb for what I'll call consumer mounts under $8,000 to $10,000, is even if they say their load capacity for astrophotography is 50 pounds, then don't plan on putting more than 25 pounds on it. If it says 30 pounds, then you're probably going to be lucky if you can put more than 15 on it. So you got to figure out what your stuff is going to weigh, and then plan on spending the most money on the mount. The other thing I recommend is look on AstroBin, other places where people post Flickr, where people post astronomy pictures, and look for pictures that you like of objects that you like, and then look at what gear is used, and you can kind of use that as a guideline for some things to do more research on. And speaking of research, take advantage of the various astro forums. Cloudy Nights is one. There are others, to see what people are saying about the gear that you are interested in, because that's a good way to find out if people are having issues or if they're really super happy or what have you. Then here's a list of some books that you might find handy. 100 Best Astrophotography Targets goes through month by month and tells you what's up in the sky and what's a good target, and some more information about the object and whatnot. So these are all good books, and check the SJAA library to see if we have these. And certainly you can purchase these. That brings us to the end of this set of videos. Again, there's lots more videos on my channel on YouTube where I walk you through setting up a mount and auto guiding and focusing and plate solving, and actually taking data on and off line resources for planning, and just basically the whole thing in more depth. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction, and we'll go on to view the rest of the materials. And also there's more material in PDF format in my Google Drive folder, which I've shared. So there's checklists and written step-by-step and other presentations that I haven't turned into videos yet that talk about how this all comes together. So you might want to check that out as well. So thanks for watching.